I think there's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years with a change in the international security system from one that where a lot of countries focus primarily on terrorist organizations, whether it's Al Qaeda, the Islamic State, organized criminal enterprises, now to a much bigger focus on major powers globally, China, the US, Russia, and others. But there has been an almost intrinsic focus with that shift on competition and potentially warfare at the conventional level. That is, the U.S. has been involved in, and I've participated in a range of them. Examples of conventional operations: the Russians invading the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the Chinese invading, and this would be some kind of air-sea battle, Taiwan. But these sound a lot like World War II style wars, either in the inter-German plains or in the Pacific Ocean, where major powers are fighting each other. The challenge today is that these major powers have nuclear weapons. And as we've seen over the past several decades, when they have come close to conflict, let's say in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the prospect of conventional and the escalation probability up to nuclear war makes them very cautious in warfare, direct warfare with each other. So at the core of competition today, and it's embedded in the question you asked, is we have competing systems, economic, political, ideological systems. U.S., Mexico, and many countries in the world are at their core democratic. They support a capitalist or largely capitalist open economic system, have freedom of the press. What we find in a range of countries, increasingly China, and what we've seen in Hong Kong, in Russia, and what we've seen in the Russian government due to opposition elements, is these are authoritarian regimes. They have tightly controlled internets, state-run media. And so in that sense, we've got competing ideologies, political systems, economic systems. And so what it suggests, if you pull those things together, is I think we will see competition just because their systems are antithetical. But what we're not likely to see is conventional warfare among nuclear powers because of the prospects that conventional war could kill large numbers of people and impact their own and global trade. That brings us down to what we call irregular warfare, or the gray zone. And that's where we're seeing the vast amount of competition today. This is information and disinformation campaigns, support to proxies, non-state partners, covert action by intelligence services, offensive cyber operations, economic coercion, the use of economic activity for political and geostrategic purposes, not just economic. Those are the elements of irregular warfare below the threshold of conventional that I think the vast majority of competition that we're likely to see today is. Actually, I think in general, the biggest challenge today with how much the U.S. wants to focus on conventional warfare as opposed to irregular warfare, there are probably at least two major factors. One is that the defense industry in the U.S. and overseas too, Europeans do sell, for example, weapon systems to the U.S. military. The platforms for conventional war are just much bigger, and look at the cost of the F-35 stealth aircraft, or if you're talking about building nuclear-powered submarines, Virginia class or Columbia class in the U.S., or aircraft carriers. So in all of these cases, the defense industry, I think, gets much richer, frankly, with big platforms and systems than it does in the irregular arena. The second issue is I think the U.S. military feels more comfortable in the conventional arena. Historically, this is where the U.S. performs better. It's got a very strong conventional military, including nuclear weapons. So, as we saw in the Gulf War between the U.S. And Iraq, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, or in the second Gulf War when the U.S. invaded Iraq, the U.S. Military moved in pretty quickly. The challenge actually has been U.S. operations in irregular warfare. The U.S. gets bogged down in Iraq, eventually gets bogged down in Afghanistan. So I think the U.S. services, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, even the Marine Corps, feel more comfortable in a conventional arena where the U.S. has a lot of advantages and where, it's got big historic victories. The Battle of Midway, that any naval officer has studied. You go back down to the irregular arena, well, I think the U.S.'s advantages actually erode somewhat. I mean, you just saw the U.S. pull out of Afghanistan after a small, poorly equipped Taliban essentially fought the U.S. successfully in that country. So this is an arena where the U.S. has definitely struggled. I think those factors probably push the U.S. To some in the U.S. to want to go back to the conventional arena. I don't see a lot yet, but I do see a lot of interest by a number of countries, Russia, China, certainly Iran, is using irregular warfare to expand their power and influence and to decrease a range of Western countries as well and weaken them. And then, in addition, to control territory. So, if we talk about the Russians, for example, the interesting thing is the Russians annexed Crimea. They actually took territorial control, not by sending in conventional forces to defeat Ukrainian forces in Crimea. They sent in Spetsnaz and Russian special operations forces and intelligence units, really clandestinely, and took Crimea without really firing a shot. So just to understand it, this is warfare that looks a lot less like the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz and much closer to the Chinese theorist and general Sun Tzu, who talked extensively about taking territory without firing a shot. The Russians then move from Crimea into eastern Ukraine. Again, they don't send in large numbers of conventional forces. They, at that point, largely leverage pro-Russian rebels. They provide weapons, systems, intelligence to them. So again, we don't really see the Russians engaging much here. And then in Syria, interesting other example, starting in 2015, the Russians conduct a range of military operations, but who are the ground forces? Well, they're not Russian soldiers. They're some Syrian units. And if we look at the maneuver elements in and around Aleppo, Lebanese Hezbollah, Palestinian militia fighters that were recruited, trained, equipped by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps from Iran. The Iranians also helped recruit other ground fighters in Syria that the Russians worked with, including those from Iraq, the Hashd al-Shabi, Popular Mobilization Forces, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and others. So we see actually the taking or the retaking of territory using not Russian soldiers in conventional war, but using irregular means. And the same thing with all the countries I looked pretty closely at. The closest Chinese example of this is what the Chinese did in the South China Sea in the Spratly Islands, where they built military bases like Fiery Cross Reef. They were atolls. They were essentially islands, mostly reefs, and they used dredgers overnight to turn them into islands. And then on those islands, they built runways for military aircraft, signals intelligence or SIGINT platforms, missile systems, electronic warfare. I mean, these are bases. And the same thing even on the Iranian side, where we've seen the Iranians expand their activity in Yemen with the Houthis, in Iraq with the Hashd al-Shaabi, in Syria with Shia militia. Again, not through direct Iranian activity, but working by, with, and through partner forces in these regions. So these are all efforts by states like Russia, China, and Iran to even control territory, but to do it, again, through irregular means rather than through conventional. And so we've seen them operate using those information, disinformation, support to state and non-state proxy forces, covert action, including cyber operations and economic coercion, rather than sending in main battle tanks and artillery and fixed-wing fighters for the most part. Well, I think the Belt and Road Initiative is a really interesting concept that the Chinese have adopted. When we even see with the withdrawal of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, the Chinese interested in opening up Afghanistan as another component to the Belt and Road Initiative. But if you look at the areas where we see both the belts and the Maritime Silk Road, as well as the Silk Road Economic Belt, we see it in key maritime waters across Asia, Indian Ocean, into the Middle East, through the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, into the Mediterranean. And then the land routes, even more significant: Africa, South Asia, East Asia, the Middle East again, and Central Asia, and then up through Europe. And we've seen the Chinese expanding that even into the Western Hemisphere as well. And what's important to understand, I think, about the Belt and Road Initiative is there certainly is an economic and technological component to the Belt and Road Initiative. We've seen the Chinese build roads, railroads, gas pipelines, ports along those lines. And I mean, this is the kind of the modern version of the Silk Road. These are essentially trade routes. But where this gets into something more than just trade is then where the Chinese will frequently go to countries where they've provided significant investments, and that is begin to use that as leverage for issues either domestically in those countries or potentially in how they vote at the UN Security Council or in the UN more broadly, or just they take positions on major global issues. We've seen the Chinese use leverage on issues related to Taiwan, pressuring of countries not to talk about one Taiwan and one China, but as one. I mean, this is the one China policy that the Chinese have been pushing, and which may mean at some point the Chinese use force in Taiwan. We've also seen the Chinese use their Belt and Road Initiative for leverage in pushing countries to adopt similar lines on Hong Kong, not to criticize what the Chinese have done in Hong Kong, countries to back off on their criticism, mostly for human rights, on the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, or land disputes in and around China and Tibet, or even on the recent border disputes between India and China. So the broader issue is using the economic leverage also for coercive purposes. That gets into something that is a little bit more concerning from an irregular warfare perspective. And I think when we look at how to respond to that, you're also talking about responding both to economic development. I do think it raises a lot of questions about how effective countries, whether it's the US, Mexico, the Europeans, are in thinking very systematically and strategically about what is their response to the Belt and Road Initiative, big investment packages. The US had the Marshall Plan in Europe after World War II. Is there something that a range of democratic countries can outline for places like Africa in the 2020s? So what's the response? The other thing too is to begin to highlight how the Chinese have also used the infrastructure projects for leverage, and in a few cases actually taken over the ports themselves. So it's to highlighting the downsides of doing this, and where there's what we call debt trap diplomacy, raising the issue diplomatically to the countries that are considering going down this road. So I think there are a number of steps that can be taken. The biggest one probably is what strategic vision and program do you have to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative? The broader issue of what to do with disinformation is a really important question. And it's one that was not as much at the crux of the Cold War, or at the very least, there were different technologies available at that point. The rise of social media and the ease with which people can access digital platforms makes this a very important issue, and one that is and can influence people right into their offices and living rooms and family rooms. And I would say there are a few things. One is that democratic countries will always struggle to some degree because with this issue, because they are open and free, and individuals are allowed to debate. When it comes to disinformation inside of authoritarian regimes, well, these are state-controlled systems that they keep very close control over the access to informations on digital platforms. The Chinese have their great firewall, which prohibits a lot of sites from being accessed when you're within China, including social media platforms. Russia has its roughly comparable RunNet, and Iran has its halal internet, which essentially allows the state to control that. But in the broader globe, we do have a lot more competition. I think there are a couple of things that will sort of help us along this road. One is there's a really important civic education component to this. And that is in our secondary and elementary schools and universities, a real focus on educating children and young adults in particular about sources of information. Where are you getting sources of information? Have there been efforts to fact check the sources? I mean, I think it's increasingly dangerous to be getting anything reliable in terms of hard news from Twitter, and what people are tweeting is so easy to manipulate people's views. Or if you're trying to get news from Facebook, Facebook pages, I think in general that people need to be educated to find sources of information that are generally objective, that fact check their data, and that you make sure you're not walking into an echo chamber. You're actually allowing yourself to hear different perspectives on issues. I mean, I subscribe to a couple of different newspapers and magazines and journals, with some more conservative, some more liberal. And I think what you want at the end of the day is people to be able to access different sorts of information. I think taking those kinds of steps educates individuals and limits the possibility that disinformation will really gain traction. But it's going to happen, frankly. It's going to happen. It's going to happen in open and democratic systems. there's a really important, though, civic education component. And there's also, I think, an important component for every single one of us to be very careful about where we're getting our information from, because it can be dangerous to believe everything you hear. Look, in my view, some will argue that because we're talking about major powers, that we're talking about a lot of the activity being done in or around the United States or China or Russia. The reality, though, is that the vast majority of competition is global in nature. It's actually not happening either mostly or even just in those countries, but it's happening in Africa, in Latin America, where take the Russians for example. Russian private military companies are involved in providing site security and a range of other activities on multiple continents. At Africa, they're in Libya and Chad and Sudan, Central African Republic, Mali, Nigeria, and a much longer list. They're active in the Middle East, they're active in Eastern Europe and South Asia. They've been heavily involved in countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua. In addition, we look at China's Belt and Road Initiative and the coercion that goes along with the economic development, heavy focus on the Western Hemisphere and Africa and South Asia. So the point here is that that competition is global in nature. And I think what it will, and if we look at the cyber domain, then you're really talking about the ease of access to everyone with access to the internet. So, I mean, I would push back to against this notion that because you're talking about, major global powers, that the vast majority of that competition actually occurs in those countries. It doesn't, and it hasn't historically. And I think what matters anyway, at the end of the day, is key alliances and partnerships as along these lines. There will always be avenues of cooperation, even among the major powers. But as I look at the Western Hemisphere, for example, I think it's important that the U.S., Canada, Mexico, these are democratic countries, Europeans, a number of the democratic countries in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Australia. These are an important bulwark against authoritarian regimes, and they'll be an important part of competition moving forward. And again, though the competition may be largely irregular, so not conventional warfare, certainly not nuclear warfare, I think what you'll see is that the competition will be to a great degree about systems, economic, political, and even military systems. And I think this is why we'll see it global in nature. So this is where I think it is just as, if not more important, to recognize that this battlefield or landscape is global in nature. Again, just as important in Latin America and in Africa as it is in Russia or China.